For 200 years, the birds of Macquarie Island had no idea what fear was supposed to feel like. Not as a concept, not as a reflex, not as the faintest whisper in their nervous systems. When the first rats came ashore in 1810, slipping off a sealing ship into grass that had never once hidden a predator, the petrels sitting in their burrows did not move. They had no reason to. In 11 million years of living on this island, nothing had ever come for them in the dark. By morning, the island was already different. It just did not know it yet. Soy Tom Marsh, and this is the story of the most expensive mistake a committee ever unmade, and the black Labrador who found the last rabbit hiding inside the burrow of the bird it had spent a century helping to destroy. Macquarie Island sits roughly halfway between Tasmania and Antarctica, 34 square kilometers of rock and grass in the middle of the Southern Ocean, smaller than Manhattan, but for most of its existence, one of the most densely inhabited places on Earth. 4 species of penguins nested here: royal, king, gentoo, and rockhopper. Elephant seals up to 3 tons hauled themselves onto the beaches. 14 species of burrowing seabirds had colonized every available slope: orchids, giant herbs, the Macquarie Island cabbage, Ross lilies. They formed dense mats across the hillsides, holding the soil together in a system so stable it barely seemed like it needed managing. It managed itself. It had been managing itself for longer than our species has existed. Scientists have a term for what these animals were: naive prey. In an island ecosystem with no land predators, the neural circuitry for fear gradually drops out across generations. There is no selection pressure to keep it. The white-headed petrels had evolved an elegant response to their only real threat, aerial hunters, squaws, by nesting underground and visiting their burrows exclusively at night, when squaws cannot hunt. A perfect solution, entirely useless against anything that could walk or dig. Before we go further, if you want to understand not just this story but the full architecture of how island ecosystems collapse and recover, the patterns that connect Macquarie to a dozen other cases the headlines never covered, the recoveries that worked, and the ones that nearly didn't, I put that together in the Rewilding Complete Pack. It's the field guide to understanding why some ecosystems bounce back and others don't, built case by case, species by species. You'll find the link in the description, or scan the code on your screen right now. Because what's coming in the next few minutes is where this story stops being about birds and starts being about something much harder to fix. The first mammal arrived in 1810. The sealers came for pelts and blubber. They left behind something they were not thinking about. Rats and mice slipped off the ships without ceremony. Then, in 1820, just 10 years after discovery, feral cats were already recorded on the island. They had been brought deliberately to stop the rats from eating stored food. A reasonable decision. It was wrong. In 1867, someone introduced the weka, a flightless rail from New Zealand, as a food source for ships' crews. The weka ate the eggs and chicks of the Macquarie Island rail and the Macquarie Island parakeet, 2 species that had evolved on this island across millions of years, found nowhere else on Earth. Within decades, both were gone. Then, in 1879, rabbits were released. The reasoning was practical: food for any sailor who might be shipwrecked here. By 1968, there were 100,000 of them. Here is what makes this sequence genuinely difficult to think about. Every single introduction had a rationale. The rats were an accident. The cats were a response to the rats. The wekas were a food supply. The rabbits were a safety net. No one was being reckless. No one was trying to destroy the island. Each decision was locally correct and globally catastrophic, and no one involved could see the full chain they were pulling on. But nothing about what came next was as simple as the problem it was supposed to solve. The cats were meant to control the rats. That was the plan, and on paper it held together. What the plan did not account for was this: The cats looked around at an island full of seabirds that had never learned to run and made an obvious choice. Seabirds were easier to catch. A petrel sitting in a burrow does not flush when a cat pushes its paw inside, it stays. Researchers estimated that by the time serious attention was paid to the problem, cats were killing around 60,000 seabirds per year. More than 160 birds every single day, year after year. The Macquarie Island rail was gone by the early 20th century. The Macquarie Island parakeet followed. In a single year, the cats killed more seabirds than the rats had managed in 2 decades. Between 1985 and June of 2000, the Australian government ran one of the largest cat eradication programs ever attempted, 15 years. 2,479 cats. The last confirmed cat was killed in June 2000, and the program was declared a success. And here's where the story stops being about what was done wrong and starts being about something harder to see. 5 years after the cats were removed, the rabbit population exploded. Not gradually. 100,000 rabbits became 300,000. The green hills turned brown. A grass called Poa annua, an invasive species from the northern hemisphere, spread across slopes where native tussock had grown for centuries. One scientist described it as golf course syndrome, a living, layered ecosystem flattened into a monoculture. The committee in 1985 had made a reasonable decision with the information they had. They had removed an animal that was killing 60,000 birds a year. What they had not been able to see was the second job that animal was quietly doing, holding the rabbit population down. Nobody had planned that job. Nobody had written it into any document. But when the cats were gone, the rabbits discovered there was nothing left to suppress them. In 2009, a team of scientists, led by Dana Bergstrom, published their findings in the Journal of Applied Ecology. They called it an unintentional trophic cascade. The study used satellite imagery, vegetation surveys, and population data, and noted it was among the first times such an event had been documented occurring rapidly and at a landscape scale. Macquarie Island had not just suffered a conservation setback, it had become a case study in what happens when you can see one link in a chain but not the whole chain at once. You may have heard the story of the wolves in Yellowstone. In 1995, 14 wolves were reintroduced and over time reshaped elk grazing patterns, which changed the riverside vegetation, which stabilized riverbanks, which literally altered the course of certain rivers. The same principle running in reverse. Remove a predator and everything it was suppressing reorganizes itself to fill the space. There is a children's song, "There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. She swallowed a spider to catch the fly, a bird to catch the spider, a cat to catch the bird, a dog to catch the cat." Each solution more dangerous than the problem it was meant to fix. The old lady dies at the end. That is not a nursery rhyme. That is a description of a trophic cascade. By 2006, Macquarie Island had 300,000 rabbits, 36,000 rats, and approximately 100,000 mice. 40% of the island's vegetation had been lost. The rabbit burrows had riddled the hillsides with tunnels, destroying the root systems holding the soil to the slope. In September of that year, a hillside on the western side of the island gave way. More than 500 square meters of slope, destabilized by a century of tunneling, collapsed into the sea. Hundreds of king penguins nesting on the flat ground below were buried alive. This was not a freak event. It was the predictable endpoint of a process that had been accumulating for decades. And after that, there was nothing left to debate. In 2007, the Australian and Tasmanian governments committed to something that had never been attempted at this scale. The plan was to eradicate all 3 invasive species simultaneously, not sequentially, not one at a time, but all 3 in a single coordinated operation. The logic was precise. Remove them one at a time, and the survivors of whichever species you target first will simply fill the space left by the ones you remove next. The total budget was 24.6 million Australian dollars. The timeline was 3 to 4 years. The operation ran in 3 layers, and each one had to work. The first layer was biological. In February of 2011, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, also known as rabbit calicivirus, was released across the island. The rabbits had encountered a biological control agent before. In 1968, the myxoma virus had cut the island's rabbit population from around 100,000 to fewer than 20,000. Then the rabbits developed immunity, and the numbers climbed back. The calicivirus was faster, more lethal, and was designed from the beginning to be the first of 3 layers, not a standalone solution. The second layer was chemical. Nearly 300 tons of brotifacum were dropped from helicopters across every hectare of the island. Brotifacum had become the standard tool for island rodent eradication programs worldwide. Not experimental, not improvised, but the most field-tested option available, deployed here at the largest scale it had ever been used. The helicopters flew precise grid patterns covering every corner of 34 square kilometers. The operation ran between April and June outside seabird nesting season, the only window that minimized bird mortality. Brotifacum works by blocking the blood's ability to clot. It is slow, and it is certain. Every person on that team understood they were making the same impossible calculation that the 1,985 committee had faced. How many animals are you willing to lose to save an ecosystem? There was no clean answer. There never is. The third layer was dogs. 12 detector dogs, each certified to reliably locate a single live animal per 20 hectares of search area. Rodenticide does not guarantee 100% mortality. A small number of animals survive through chance, different location, different behavior, different exposure. The dogs were trained to detect only living animals, not carcasses, to avoid false positives from the mass die-off happening all around them. They were not checking whether the operation had worked. They were checking whether it had worked completely. The difference between 99% and 100% was the entire point. Melissa Houghton had spent years training detector dogs for island eradication programs. She had never worked at this scale. When she arrived on Macquarie Island in July of 2011, her estimate was that approximately 30 rabbits remained alive. 30 animals across 34 square kilometers of rocky terrain, cliff faces, subterranean burrow networks, and winds that regularly exceeded 120 kilometers per hour. A single surviving doe can produce up to 30 offspring per year. On an island with recovering vegetation and no natural predators, that is enough to restart the entire cascade. Her black Labrador was named Wags. By November of 2011, 4 months into the search, the teams had located 13 rabbits. Then, in a remote section of the island, Wags stopped. He pressed his nose to the ground and held it there. The trainers know this posture. They call it the freeze. The dog goes still and breathes through the scent. The team began to dig. Inside the burrow was an adult doe. She was not alone. She was sharing the burrow with a seabird. The last rabbit on Macquarie Island was hiding inside the burrow of the animal it had spent 130 years helping to erase. A second dog handler, Sandy King, surveyed the surrounding area and found 4 juvenile rabbits nearby. A family, 5 animals, the last invasive mammals on the island. After that, nothing. The team swept the island twice more. 0 detections. On the 8th of April, 2014, 204 years after the first sealing ship dropped anchor, Macquarie Island was officially declared pest-free. Scientists had estimated that meaningful ecological recovery would take between 30 and 50 years. Within 18 months, seeds that had lain dormant in the soil for decades began to germinate. Native tussock grasses, the keystone plant of the island's original ecosystem, began resprouting on bare hillsides within 2 growing seasons. Orchids that had survived only inside fence research enclosures spread into open ground. The white-headed petrel had been losing roughly 11,000 individuals per year to cat predation during the 1970s. Only about 15% of nests successfully fledged a chick. A decade after eradication, nesting success had climbed to close to 80%. Gray petrels and blue petrels had been absent from the main island since the early 20th century. They came back on their own, no reintroduction program, no translocation effort. They arrived, found the island habitable again, and stayed. And here is the part worth saying plainly. The Macquarie Island rail and the Macquarie Island parakeet are not coming back. Two species that lived here for millions of years, found nowhere else on Earth, gone forever within decades of contact. The island can be restored. Those specific species cannot. That is a sentence worth sitting with. What survived was the island's capacity to be itself again, and the lesson that you cannot understand an ecosystem by looking at one thread at a time. The people who introduced cats were not wrong that rats were a problem. The committee that removed the cats was not wrong that 60,000 birds a year was a catastrophe. They were each right about their piece of the chain. None of them could see the whole chain. What changed between 1810 and 2014 was not the ecology of the island. It was the ability to hold the entire chain in view before pulling any part of it. Every ship that travels to Macquarie Island today carries a detector dog. The dog checks the cargo in Hobart before the ship departs. It checks again when the ship arrives. The eradication program ended in 2014. The biosecurity operation it created has no end date. An island is not fixed. It is protected permanently. Which brings me to the question worth leaving in the comments. If you had been on that committee in 1985, knowing the cats were killing 60,000 birds a year, but not yet knowing what would happen when you removed them, what would you have done? There is no right answer. But I think how you reason through it says something real about how we understand our place in these systems. Leave your answer below. I read them. If this story changed how you think about what we owe these places, share it with someone who needs a reason to believe the damage is not always permanent. And if you want more of these, the cases where the cascade ran the other way, where one decision upstream remade everything downstream, there are more stories like this than you would imagine, and I have many more to tell you. Soy Tom Marsh. Gracias por ver.